Welcome to Divorce Dialogues. I'm Catherine Miller. Divorce Dialogues brings expert guests to the airwaves to talk through your divorce questions and fill in the gray areas about separating. From thinking about divorce to how to behave during divorce to what to do after, this is Divorce Dialogue. Welcome to Divorce Dialogues. I'm Catherine Miller. I'm the founder of the Miller Law Group and a trainer at the Center for Understanding in Conflict, and I am on a mission to change how people divorce and help them divorce with dignity. And I'm thrilled that my guest today is Demi Yoshida, LMSW. She's a therapist at My Wellbeing who specializes in guiding young adults through life transitions, trauma recovery, and identity exploration. Demi is trained in CBT, DBT, and psychodynamic therapy, and she brings a compassionate, culturally sensitive approach to helping clients heal, build resilience, and create meaningful change. Welcome, Demi Yoshida, to the show.
Hi, Catherine. Thank you so much for having me on today.
I think it would be really great if we just started by talking about what CBT and DBT are so that our listeners have an understanding of where you're coming from.
Sure thing, yes. And definitely in therapy lingo, there's a lot of acronyms being thrown around. So I'm glad you're bringing attention to this. So CBT essentially stands for cognitive behavioral therapy. So it's a type of psychotherapy that helps individuals understand the relationship between their feelings, thoughts, and behaviors. And then DBT stands for Dialectical Behavioral Therapy. So very similar to CBT, except we're seeing more of the behavioral integration piece. So DBT essentially focuses on the ability to thinking greater flexibility, avoid binary thought patterns, and ultimately improve relationships with others, and then also reduce self-harm.
That sounds really important. And I know that you work with a lot of adults through life transitions, identity exploration, and this is a show about divorce. And so I'm wondering how you see, if you see, divorce when children of the marriage are in young adulthood or emerging adulthood, and how that shapes their identity, their resilience, and if it has an impact or what that is.
Yeah, so I'm really glad you brought up the young adulthood slash emerging adulthood phase. And so, emerging adulthood, as you probably already know, is that stage between adolescence and adulthood. And it's ultimately characterized by identity exploration, this feeling of instability, and another feeling of that being in between things. And so some specific clients come to mind, either them having gone through divorce at age 21, like so getting married at a younger age, divorcing at a younger age, and then also adults who were children who had witnessed the parents' divorce. And so a lot of the times when unpacking the traumatic events of the divorce, we discuss a lot about that role redefinition. So what it means to fulfill the role as daughter, son, boyfriend, partner. So really unpacking what each of those roles mean to the client, and discussing potential sources of abuse that may have occurred, right? So not obviously not in every dynamic, but certainly trauma of bearing witness to a separation or being the or I guess bearing the grunt of the impact of that divorce that can manifest in certain behaviors. And then when I support clients with recovering from that divorce or traumatic events, any really big life change, we really discuss the values and vision reassessment. So I've seen clients develop resilience through ordinary magic, and I call it ordinary magic because evidence shows that resilience is attainable through our everyday human capabilities rather than a super strength or unattainable mindset. And I always tell clients that trauma is something they don't like just get over, it's something they learn to live with. So once the client is able to realize their capability, that they can become capable of resilience, then the world really begins to open up for them despite the impact of their trauma.
Okay, so you said a lot there, Demi. So let's see if we can unpack that a little bit more. So, one of the things that I observe sometimes when there are children of the divorce who are in late adolescence or emerging adulthood who look like adults
Mhm.
and in some ways act like adults, and they may be sexually active, they may have a steady girlfriend or boyfriend, and a parent going through a divorce may really treat that child as a friend and a
Mhm.
confidant. And I'm wondering, in your experience, how traumatic that is, how difficult that is. Is that an okay thing to do? Because lots of times people say, "Oh, my children deserve to know the truth," and I'm not sure that's an accurate statement. So I'm wondering, from the perspective of a treating therapist, for someone who might be talking to that adult child, right? Adult looking child. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, that's a very complex thing you're addressing, right? So essentially, I think what you're talking about is childhood adultification, right? So when a parent shares or they're crossing a inappropriate boundary between like parent to child. And so
Exactly.
yeah, a lot of the times that can create confusion for the child, or later in life, that child can feel resentment about like hearing these things against their will that they maybe didn't want to know in the first place. So I think as a parent, right, you really have to think about what you're trying to achieve with the self-disclosure. Is it to feel better about yourself, or, how would your child actually benefit from knowing the truth?
Yeah. And it's also you also talked about role definition. About that at this age, child people, right, going through
Mhm.
this developmental stage are starting to define what these roles mean to them based on their experience and their observing of the world, including their parents. And I think that for people who are thinking about divorce, I think this is a really interesting question because one of the things that led me to think about divorce when my children were young is that I didn't want my children growing up thinking this is what marriage was. And I
Mhm.
think for a lot of people who are staying together for the kids, I put air quotes on that for our listeners, right? That like
Mhm.
yeah, you are holding the family together, but at what cost? So I'm asking you, Demi Yoshida, at what cost are we staying together for the kids?
Right, exactly. And you really have to think like, is staying together for the sake of the kids, is that because you're avoiding the divorce and like it's bringing up internalized feelings, internalized messages of personal failure? Or are you really altruistically trying to keep this family together? And then, if the family is kept together, right, that negative emotion, the resentment, the underlying feelings, they're going to come up somehow. And so the quality of that family dynamic is certainly going to be impacted if you're staying in a maybe perhaps a toxic relationship or a difficult one. But I think it's completely understandable why that is a myth to begin with in the first place. Our society really does place emphasis on that two-parent double income household. But you're absolutely right. There is a cost at either the parents or the child's psychological well-being as well.
And so when you're working with a client, an adolescent, or we're talking about the child, right? Who's
Mhm.
not a little guy or gal, right?
Yeah.
It's a, older child. And how do you use the techniques that we talked about previously to help that person deal with the trauma of the breakup or the divorce?
Right, great question. And so when it comes to CBT, DBT, and then also psychodynamic therapy as well. So to start off, one of the core reasons I got into the field is to understand where things come from. And in addition to changing our relationship to our thoughts, feelings, behaviors, for me, as a clinician, it's also very important to understand what led the client to the metaphorical chair in the first place. So for the psychodynamic process, I start by educating and exploring with the client about attachment theory. So essentially, one's personal comfort with intimacy or closeness, lack thereof, and then a person's preoccupation about the relationship. And so, divorce, especially for young adults, witnessing this can bring up a lot of internalized negative messaging about our self-worth. However, we see that's more likely to happen when a person has an insecure attachment style to begin with. And so, while I'll start with exploring the client's attachment style, this will dictate what types of CBT or DBT strategies I implement.
I'm Catherine Miller, and you're listening to Divorce Dialogues, a podcast dedicated to educating people about divorce related topics so everyone can divorce with dignity. Subscribe to the podcast wherever you listen to podcasts to be sure that you don't miss an episode. And I'm talking today with Demi Yoshida about treating children, older children of divorce, so that they can deal with the trauma and disruption in a way that really allows them to be resilient and live successful lives, which most children of divorce are perfectly capable of doing if they can go through the divorce with the kind of support that they need and they're not subject to, in my understanding, the repeated conflict between their parents. Is that your understanding as well?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, and so for the listeners who do have children or who are themselves struggling with emotional regulation during and after divorce, can you give us a DBT skill or two that might help somebody deal with managing their overwhelming emotions in the context of divorce?
Yeah, sure thing. So, one I heavily utilize in sessions is that rainbow emotion wheel. So, the emotion wheel is essentially a circular graph that helps provide emotional literacy and language to identify and understand our feelings. And this is so important because each emotion communicates a specific need or provides a different function. So, how do we fix something if we don't know how to name it in the first place? So, thinking about anger, for example, right? Anger can often be a mask for pain, grief, etc., but it can also be a protective and motivating factor as well. And so, understanding our emotions and what it could be masking is really important for our brain to understand so that we can then cope effectively.
Okay, so I think that there's a lot of literature out there about the mind body connection,
Mhm.
right? And actually, I was really interesting. I was listening to something over the weekend about the distinction between a feeling and an emotion.
Mhm.
And I'd be interested to hear what your thought, Demi, was about like the distinction between the emotion and in that the podcast that I was listening to, they were talking about the emotion being sort of the physical ramification, like the actual adrenaline or whatever it is that's running, and the feeling then being what you do with it. And I think that when you're thinking about the mind body connection, what you do with it is really the important thing. And so I'm wondering what your thoughts are and if there are some techniques that people can implement to help them deal with those feelings.
Right. So, in terms of the mind body connection, I also loved how you identified the difference between emotion versus feeling. Certainly, a lot of emotions can or feelings manifest physically, and that can be connected to physical, mental pain, and vice versa. The two influence each other. And so, skill I really love, rooted in DBT, is coping with the five senses. So, using sensory, somatic coping skills to provide a sense of relief. So, coping with sound, listening to your favorite music or a soundtrack that brings you back to a nostalgic, positive time in your life. Using taste, right? Usually connecting with food from your childhood that you loved. Anything really to anchor you to the present can be a great way to emphasize the mind body connection. and provide like somatic relief.
And so imagine there's a parent listening today and that they're going through a divorce or they're divorced and they're really struggling with co-parenting and it's bringing up all kinds of intense emotions for them. What advice or tools would you offer to that person to help them navigate the conflict and also maintain the healthy boundaries? Because, one thing that happens, I think, is when people are newly divorced, they're still trying to explain themselves, right? As if somehow or other they're it explaining themselves is going to heal the relationship. And it's kind of a leftover habit from that long relationship of the marriage. But sometimes it's just, you know, sticking with need to know is better. So what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, to your point, I mean, co-parenting is a very difficult dynamic to navigate. And obviously, depending on the terms of the divorce, like a person's presence can either be a painful or constant trigger of, things that happened during the relationship. So when it,
Exactly. Yeah.
right. So when it comes to navigating conflict and maintaining healthy boundaries, a communication tool I really love to use is called Dearman, like Dearman. So this communication skill promotes interpersonal and objective effectiveness. And so really love the skill because it uses I statements rather than you should, because typically people don't respond well to orders. It takes into account delivery, time, and place, right? Like addressing your co-parent when it's the least stressful, best time to talk, acknowledging how the delivery is coming across. And then the part I love the most is the negotiation and compromise part. So, in order to get, people also have to be willing to give. So, finding solutions should be a collaborative process. And I really encourage clients to explore alternative solutions that work for both them and their other co-parent if their co-parent disagrees with the initial solution they propose.
You're listening to the Divorce Dialogues podcast, and I'm Catherine Miller. Divorce Dialogues has been educating people about divorce and relationship issues for over 10 years. Subscribe to the podcast, and don't forget to check out our previous episodes on the podcast website, divorcedialogues.com. And I'm talking today with Demi Yoshida about parenting adult and emerging adult children and teenage children as well. And Demi, if people wanted to learn more about you, about your practice, how can they do that?
Sure. So you can either find me on Psychology Today. So Psychology Today is essentially like a LinkedIn for therapists. So you can just enter my name into the search bar, and then also you can also find my practitioner page with mywellbeing.com/practitioners Demi Yoshida.
That's great. I know that you also have a background in cultural humility, and I just wonder what you would want listeners to know about how cultural or family backgrounds shape people's experience of both divorce and recovery, and especially for those children.
Right. So I love that you brought up cultural humility rather than competence, right? So cultural humility implies that, we might not ever know the full experience. Like we can try to put ourselves in other people's shoes, but it doesn't mean we're going to understand their whole lived experience. So, with that being said, I like to view culture as a double-edged sword. So, it can both be a protective factor that creates community as well as a barrier to healing. And depending on what culture or personal family background you have, that can certainly impact mental health and divorce stigma, and then ultimately access to mental health services when healing from breakup or separation. So things like patriarchal norms, gender roles, language accessibility, and the expectations of appearances can shape what one's healing journey may look like.
I think this is a really interesting topic because what the culture is could be large or small, right? It could be the culture of the family. Like when
Yeah.
it comes to divorce, right? Like I was the first person in my family to ever get divorced, and my grandmother told me before I got married for the first time that I could never get divorced. And listeners to the show know this. She died before I did get divorced, so I didn't have to cross that boundary, with her. And still to this day, only me and one of my cousins is divorced. Everybody else is still married, and for better or for worse. And it could also just be it's part of your church or part of your ethnic heritage or whatever. Or divorce is very common and it's bad or it's good, or you know what I'm saying? And so I
Yeah.
think like taking into account the kind of background, the environment that a person grew up with and is out there really implicates like how much shame there is, how much guilt there is, how much resistance there is versus acceptance and love.
Absolutely, right? And like navigating that shame and guilt, and thank you for sharing your story with me as well, right? Balancing shame and guilt is a very difficult thing to do because guilt implies like negative feelings over a specific action or situation versus shame implies like negative messages about yourself and your identity. So we want to make sure that guilt, because sometimes guilt can be a positive motivator or a moral compass, if you will. But when that guilt turns to shame, like when it becomes, I made a mistake to I am the mistake, that's when things can get dangerous. And that's when healing becomes much more difficult to do.
Yeah. What's one myth or misunderstanding about trauma recovery after divorce that you think it would be great if more people understood?
Yeah. So a myth I've certainly heard, and I've heard this in sessions as well with the way that clients have talked about their own divorce or events leading up to it, is that divorce means personal failure, or people tend to over identify this as a tragic loss. And I don't love this because it oversimplifies the complex nature of human relationships and ordinary resilience. So, the end of something can actually be the beginning of a new adventure, right? And so, a lot of times people do state an improved quality of life, a stronger connection to their values, and a stronger sense of identity after the divorce. However, I definitely want to be mindful not to paint divorce in a light of toxic positivity. In a season of mass layoffs, horrible job market at the moment, any massive change can certainly be jarring to our nervous system. So I think it's important to view divorce in an empowering yet realistic light.
It's interesting, Demi Yoshida. I think of divorce as the intersection between what was and will be.
Mhm,
And it's definitely a place of change and uncertainty,
mhm,
right? But it's also a place of opportunity. And
mhm,
that people have if they're willing to think about their values and what's most important to them and who they authentically are, that they can craft a future for themselves that is better than the past, but it's not easy. So if you're really stuck in, I can't believe that happened to me, anger and resentment, then that's going to not be easy to do. But if you're thinking about what is most important to me, and given where I am today and the resources that I have, how can I craft a future for myself that's different than what I intended, but that actually is more aligned with who I am today? Because when you get married, typically you're much younger than you are in the time that you're getting divorced, right? And so
mhm,
you've changed a lot. And taking stock of who I am, each of us today, and
mhm.
where I want to go that's different maybe than where I thought I was 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago. It's a really interesting opportunity, especially if they get to work with somebody like you.
Yeah, and I love the language you had just said about the crossroads between like opportunity and like this difficult change, right? So again, right, like the ending can be an opportunity for a new beginning, and that can certainly look like people living more authentically in alignment with their values and just being more intentional. Because I think the hardest pill to swallow sometimes for a lot of us is that people grow apart. We become different versions of ourselves over time in a marriage, in a career, really anything.
I think that's a great place for us to end. Demi Yoshida, thank you so much for being my guest on Divorce Dialogues. It's really been a pleasure.
Thank you so much, Catherine, for having me. Take care.